All right, with based on a true story. One sec, I just have to change the view. Speaker only. There we go. All right, based on a true story. So if anyone has ever seen a movie or seen a trailer, I guarantee you have seen this phrase, based on a true story, inspired by a true story, based on real events. This, we've all seen a variation on this phrase. Real life is often stranger than fiction and can be the basis for a lot of films. So how are we going to define true story right now? I am just going to put it as a specific event or the life of a person, and with the caveat that it is usually dramatized for the sake of cinema. I think just up front, I think everyone here knows you really should never look at any of these movies as 100% fact. Stuff is changed around, even if it's small things, for the sake of dramatic effect, for making the storytelling a little bit tighter, or just better storytelling in general. I have met grown adults who have watched some movies and thought they were 100% accurate and had to tell them, like, not quite. So there are people out there that do think like these movies are 100% real, but I think most discerning viewers of film kind of know, they're like, I know I'm getting a Hollywood version of the true story. And usually that was the case. I have found that through the years, based on a true story stuff, in particular, biopics have gotten a lot better, a lot more nuanced, and they've kind of moved away from just being love letters to the subject. I mean, if you compare a film like Gandhi, the 1982 film, which kind of mythologizes the man to the point of, Todd, would hagiography be a good word for that film, or?
I think so, especially by today's standard. Yeah.
It basically ignores any of the man's faults, and Gandhi was a human being. Gandhi had a lot of, did a lot of great things. Gandhi also had a lot of flaws. He had some views that weren't good. But a movie like, 1982 film kind of ignores that in favor of the mythologizing of him, whereas newer biopics will at least try to address those things. So what are some popular topics for biopics? Abraham Lincoln is a constant favorite. John Ford's Young Mr. Lincoln, and then we have Steven Spielberg, Daniel Day-Lewis's Lincoln. He is a consistent topic of the silver screen, and even stuff that relates to him. There was the film, I believe it was called The Conspirator, which was about people who may have aided and abetted John Wilkes Booth. And this is also, as a librarian, I see this in books as well. Abraham Lincoln is up there with the Kennedys in terms of just people will never not write about him. And you always got to wonder, like, how much more is there? And that kind of goes for the silver screen as well. World War II, a very popular topic, probably because it is, in a way, there is something cinematic about that war. It's a war where it's like there clearly was a good side and a bad side. It was the good versus evil, which is what a lot of people like in their fiction. They're like, I want something to be fairly simple in terms of I want a side to root for and I want a side to root against. And it's not just explored in America, it's explored in a lot of European films. It's also explored in China. China often explores the Japanese occupation or the rebel army fighting back against the Japanese. In Japan, believe it or not, has covered World War II as well. I think a good example would be Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence. But I mean, Japan, especially more in couple of recent decades, what they cover is, let's just say they select what they cover about World War II. Actually, one of the great World War II movies, I have not seen it, but it's constantly brought up, is a Soviet era film called Come and See. Which, Todd, have you seen Come and See or no?
Not yet. It is on my to-do list.
Yeah, it's one of those where it's like I've got to get myself ready for that. It's sort of like why I don't think I would ever watch the documentary show. I'm like, I don't know if I have it in me for 9 hours of that. And as I mentioned earlier, biopics, just real people, a never-ending supply of movies. We have Malcolm X, I Want to Live, Coal Miner's Daughter, La Bamba Ray, and I actually, full disclosure, when I was writing this list, this was just stuff I came up off the top of my head. I was like, oh, wow, I got like 6 examples within 2 seconds. And within the past year, 2021, big year for biopics. We had Aretha Franklin in Respect. We had Diana and Spencer. We had Tammy Faye in The Eyes of Tammy Faye. We had Serena and Venus Williams' father and King Richard. And recently this year, we just had the Elvis biopic come out, which, there's definitely stuff that's real in there or real things that are alluded to. And then there are things that are either glossed over, cough, cough, how old Priscilla was when she met Elvis, or stuff that is kind of fabricated. But again, most of these filmmakers will say, I'm not making a documentary, I am making a movie. And in some cases, drama comes first. And also, great way to get an Oscar nomination. If you look at what wins Best Picture, or at least gets nominated, or what is a good shoe-in to get an acting nomination, it's playing somebody who is famous. I believe the past, well, there's Rami Malek won. And Will Smith won last year. But yeah, I was gonna say Sean Penn won for Milk. Oh, I'm not doing well with my Oscar winners. What's happening to me? But yes, go.
Wasn't that how Gary Oldman finally got his win?
Oh yes, that's right. Gary Oldman won for playing Winston Churchill. There we go. But yeah, a lot of the winners are going to be people playing someone who is real. There is already kind of a built-in, like, wow, you really disappeared into this role, became the character. Daniel Day-Lewis won for playing Abraham Lincoln. It's kind of considered a shoe-in to a nomination, if not a win. And speaking of Oscar winners, we're going to start off with not really a compare and contrast, because both of these films, 1997's Titanic and 1958's A Night to Remember, are both very well regarded as fairly accurate tellings of the sinking of the Titanic, which has been the subject of more films. There was a 1953 film called Titanic, which is not well reviewed and pretty poorly regarded in terms of a historically accurate representation. But A Night to Remember and Titanic are very well regarded. Titanic is probably the more well-known of the two. I mean, Titanic held the box office record for the highest grossing film of all time for over 10 years. And just had a streak of like 14 weeks being #1 at the box office, something I don't think A Night to Remember did. But both films are well regarded, but there are certain things that they get wrong, or certain choices are made. So A Night to Remember, it gives you, much like with 1997, 2 fictional main characters who, aren't really based on anyone who was on the ship. But Night to Remember, they have the real people featured. However, they don't use the real names. They did not have the legal life rights at that point. So they're like, well, we can't get in trouble if we make a change. Also, a scene that's very iconic thanks to Titanic at this point, the band playing Nearer My God to Be as the ship is sinking as the final song. That has become almost accepted as a factual thing that happened. However, that's more lore that has been fed by these films. It's really more, it's not determined what was the last song and if it was played at all. So what is documented is that for much of the lifeboats being filled up, the band was playing happy music to keep people upbeat. However, as things were looking grim, or as the last song, the legend has it they decided to play Nearer My God to Thee. There were some accounts from passengers that survived that this was played, but at the end of the day, this can't be confirmed because memory can be iffy. And also, in terms of what the last song was, by the time they played the last song, all of the lifeboats were gone. And while there were people who were rescued from the water, a majority of the people who probably would have been there to hear what the final song was were already off the ship. And keep in mind, Titanic was a big ship. So some of the people who survived might not have even been near there. There's actually a really good Snopes article that kind of goes down to like, yes, this could very possibly be true. However, there's no way of knowing, and here is why. But this is where that lore really started to enter the kind of the pop culture. And I would say the biggest inaccuracy of Night to Remember is really not the fault of the makers of the film. So when the ship sinks, it sinks intact. It does not break in half as it does in 1997's film. That is absolutely forgivable because at the time, most people thought, oh, it must have sank. It must have sunk intact. Again, a lot of the people who were in the water were cold and panicking, and it was dark. They couldn't necessarily see what was happening. It's same with people in the lifeboats. And by the time the people in the lifeboats came back, or the ship was underwater. So then we have Titanic, which James Cameron, who is very obsessed with the ocean and was very obsessed with Titanic for about 15 years before Avatar came along and became his new obsession. And he's still obsessed with water in the ocean. We get it, James. That's cool. It's great to have a hobby. But he really tried to put as much effort as he could into getting the sinking of the ship accurate. And unlike Night to Remember, he did have the real people featured. Well, not the real people, they're gone, but you know, Kathy Bates portrays Molly Brown. You had Victor Garber playing the guy who helped build the ship. Like, basically, the people who were on the ship were named. And on one hand, that worked really well because again, there was more documentation, there was more written about it. So even if there were characters that kind of did something that they didn't really do, he tried to make sure it was within character for what they would have done. Like Victor Garber's character, when you see him, he's just sitting looking at a clock. That is based on a number of eyewitness accounts of like, well, the last we saw him, he was just kind of sitting in the room, staring into the middle distance. So potentially that is what happened. We have a little bit more information about people like the unsinkable Molly Brown, as it were. Actually, if you've seen Titanic or if you remember it, there's a scene as the ship is sinking with an older couple in bed together. Those are actually based on a real couple. It was the founder of Macy's and his wife. And there's a deleted scene where his wife actually refuses to get on a lifeboat. She's like, nope, I'm staying with you. And I believe they actually tried to make room for their maid to go instead, but those people were based on a real couple that decided to stay on the ship together. What this did, considering Cameron was really focused on accuracy and really focused on wanting to get all the real people in there, this kind of bit him with the portrayal of First Officer William Murdoch. If you're not familiar with who he is in the film, he is the one he's seen taking bribes from a first-class passenger, and most famously, and this is where the controversy comes in, he shoots at panicking passengers, kills one, and then takes his own life. There has been some support to him taking his life. However, the portrayal in the film, both his descendants and actually, he's from a Scottish town called Dalbeattie. He's considered a hero there. And by all accounts, he is someone who tried to do the best he could in a really awful situation. Both the family and the town were not happy with this and actually demanded an apology from Fox and Cameron himself. Fox definitely did some damage control, and James Cameron admitted, like, his words were, I was thinking more like a screenwriter right then and there. And he did try to kind of save face, going like, I didn't think I depicted him as cowardly. People make rash decisions when they're panicked, but the town of Dalbeattie is still, and the family as well. They run a website devoted to First Officer Murdoch. They're still not entirely happy with this movie. Even, and they've gone as far as to go as like, we never really got an apology. But this is what happens when you're like, well, we're trying to do something based on true events and be accurate. When you kind of stray and do something for dramatic effect and use a real person's name, you're going to have people who are angry at you, who are like, excuse me, that is not, either that's not what he did. A historian might say like, this is false, or you will have family members saying like, we think you just slandered our ancestor in the biggest movie in the world. And again, as I said before, people should not take history lessons from Titanic, but a lot of people might look at that film and go, well, he got the sinking of the Titanic so right, he probably got other things right as well. And that's where this idea of what responsibility does a filmmaker have when it comes to telling a true story comes in. So with this, I am going to let Todd wanted to discuss JFK. I'm just going to put a little note in here. This movie is the source of a joke in my family because my mother hates this movie. She's always said like, your father and I finally got a night out away from you kids. And he's like, let's go see JFK. And she's like, worst 3 hours of my life. And I hate Kevin Costner. He's the same character in every movie. And it all stems from her watching JFK, her dislike of Kevin Costner. So I'll always joke like, oh, JFK, your favorite film. But with that, I'll let Todd actually, talk about stuff with substance.
Well, I mean, this is probably going to wind up being just the fillet of JFK, because the fact is, there is a lot of discourse over this movie. Oliver Stone has kind of become a thorn in a lot of historians' sides because, number one, there's a lot of people who took this film as entirely fact. Number two, he himself maintained like he kind of dug his heels in on this one. Someone infamously so to the point where he actually wrote a New York Times op-ed defending the film as basically him standing up for truth. And to his very slight credit, the film kind of had that effect where it did kind of prompt the idea of releasing more of the documents around the assassination. But what the film also posits is not supported by a lot of those documents that were then released. And actually this kind of goes back into the question of the earlier mentioned hagiography. If you want, I'm going to make a bit of a plug here because there is one source I'd say makes a good kind of highlight reel for some of the issues with this. There's a podcast out there called Unclear and Present Danger, which their entire upshot is they go through political thrillers of the 80s and 90s and kind of look at them at the time of it was the post-Cold War, what was Hollywood seeing as the new enemy? And they kind of went into this partially as the idea of why was this film as big a hit as it was? What was it saying about like where the country is at in terms of how they were trusting the government and whatnot? They had a historian on for that episode who kind of specializes in presidential history, and they talked about the fact the film it's a hagiography both for Jim Garrison and for Kennedy himself. Like the film really it kind of really helped build into a lot of the mythology about JFK as this clear-eyed, forward-thinking, progressive hero. And he did have a lot of things he was right about, but there were also some things he was decidedly not quite the lionized hero that people have come to accept him as. Like they talk about the film posits the idea that part of the reason Kennedy was assassinated was he would not have allowed Vietnam to happen. He was against a lot of like the CIA spycraft stuff, which some historians have actually looked at and went, no, Kennedy actually really liked some of this stuff. He was behind a lot of this. One of the people in that podcast episode kind of jokingly puts it best. The real life JFK would have been one of the guys who would kill movie JFK. Like he would have been behind that assassination. And yeah, again, the film really kind of, it tries to portray Jim Garrison as like this stoic American hero, even though, yes, he brought Clay Shaw to trial. The problem is that case didn't work out for him because he really didn't have a case. Like half the people working for him quit because they just kind of looked and went, I can't deal with this. You're obsessed. This is not working. The film only really has one of them quit, but it really downplays the fact that a lot of people around him were going, what are you doing? Stop this. This is crazy. And as that last
but
point
the
notes,
film, but in the film, it's like they're the ones telling him to stop, but you know, rather than them being the voices of reason, it's like Jim Garrison is the one sane man.
which again also goes into that last point there. Yeah, the film not only, it's like the film half downplays and it actually kind of leans into Garrison's homophobia, because it does sort of play the idea of essentially part of what killed Kennedy was a secret gay underworld in Washington D.C. And again, it's kind of weird looking at it, realizing, yeah, there were a lot of people who took this film entirely at face value and just accepted what it was laying down, because and actually there's something said for this, because people have argued one of the interesting assets of the film is it does kind of show the appeal of conspiratorial thinking. It's taking something which is seen as this tragic, shocking piece of American history, and it's trying to make it make sense. Even though when you actually look at the pieces, the story doesn't line up. The fact is, the story creates a comfortable narrative where you can go, okay, that this wasn't like some horrific thing no one can see coming. Someone planned it. That is somehow more comforting to some people than the idea that, if you'll excuse the term, crap happens.
Yeah. Well, we you and I, we listened to like the QAnon Anonymous podcast, and I like seeing that conspiracy take off in real time. But like a lot of people who talk about conspiracy say that's why people like it. It offers a very neat answer in the face of uncertainty. And for some people, even if it's a narrative of this giant world order who assassinated a president, it is more comforting than the idea of, wait, one unhinged individual could have bypassed all of this security, all of these bodyguards, and killed a president. The latter is more comforting because it offers a simple explanation. It's very similar to some of the COVID misinformation we saw, where for some people, the idea that this was a planned outbreak was more comforting than the idea of, sorry, this is a new disease. We have no idea where it came from. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't know when there will be a vaccine. But the idea of, don't worry, this is all planned, you know, by the New World Order, it at least offers an answer. And for some people, that's all they want is an answer. And
also, yeah, I need to point out one of those sort of details I'd almost left out here as far as how the film depicts Garrison. So there's a reason that the film is so sunny towards him. It's based on his book.
Oh, and it's just like I like some of Oliver Stone's movies. I think Platoon is a great film, and clearly that came from, I think, Oliver Stone's. I think he was reflecting his experience in Vietnam pretty clearly there. I think Wall Street's a great movie, but I think at this point, Oliver Stone's kind of a crackpot. Not a bad filmmaker, but a crackpot. And
oh yeah, that's actually kind of the consistency. Is like, this is a well-made movie. It's engaging, but historically, it gets so much wrong.
And it put my mother off to Kevin Costner for a lifetime. Speaking of Oliver Stone and national tragedies, we're moving on to United 93. So in 2006, two movies about 9/11 were made, both kind of with the idea of, is it too soon? One of them was Oliver Stone's World Trade Center, which everyone was, I think, really white knuckling over. Is this going to get into 9/11 being an inside job? And it wasn't. It was, if anything, a very restrained, almost un-Oliver Stone movie, and kind of boring, which was why I decided not to talk about it. But the other one that came out was Paul Greengrass's United 93. And Paul Greengrass is someone who, for this, strove to be for authenticity, i.e., he did not cast very well-known or recognizable actors. In fact, he cast a lot of amateurs. He wanted to be as close to the events and the timeline and use the information that was available at hand. And he did not want this to be a very incendiary movie, although the originally the film had a line after the end, was like, the war on terror began. And there were there was critique of like, this seems almost to bring this into a propaganda film. And he did change that to just dedicated to the lives lost. And I think this is a very interesting film because I'm like, I think this is an example as to how you do a film about a tragedy without being exploitative, because I think there's always the question when something this awful happens and you're going to make a movie about it, a movie that is going to make money. It is like, are you exploiting the deaths of these people? And so what he tried to do was make it almost, he kind of had a docudrama feel to it. So didn't use known actors. He didn't, even the moment where the passenger says, let's roll, it's not this big bombastic moment. It's just something whispered and they're like, all right, let's do this. And it's, I would say, like, just based on what's here, probably one of the more accurate films we have. And again, that's because I think Greengrass knew, like, this is still a very real open wound for the people of this country. And he wanted this to be a celebration of ordinary people who did what they could. There were some issues with it, though. I mean, some of the stuff, it's just timeline changes. That is for the sake of, we need to move this along. There's speculation that one of the hijackers might have been actually hesitant to do this, which is why it took longer for the plane to be hijacked. The biggest controversy came from the family of Christian Adams, who is a German passenger. And he was someone who on the flight at first was like, maybe we should just cooperate with them. And the family felt he was portrayed as cowardly. But from Greengrass's perspective, he's like, well, at this point in time, the history of planes being hijacked was not what had happened on 9/11. It was usually we're going to be parked somewhere, we're going to be held for ransom, we're going to be exchanged. So it was that idea of like, let's just get through this and make this out alive. And that idea of maybe if we cooperate, we can maybe prevent this. That was Greengrass's, like, that's what I was trying to portray. He was someone who was not cowardly, but trying to operate on previous knowledge and essentially didn't want anyone to get killed. But it is a film I did not see until a few years after it was made, but I would actually recommend really checking it out, because I would look at it as like, this is a good way to tell a true story, and especially something as, as painful for a lot of people as 9/11 was. But to tell it and to not utilize it to be jingoistic or to be incendiary towards anybody, but to simply tell the story of ordinary heroism. So we're moving on from one 9/11 to another 9/11. I don't know if anyone is familiar with the date of September 11th as it relates to Chile in 1973. But back then, on that date in 1973, there was a coup that overthrew a democratically elected leader, Salvador Allende, in Chile. He was a leader who was definitely more to the left. And it was theorized for a very long time that the US helped back and support this coup. And only very recently has the US kind of been like, so we may have supported it a little bit. I don't think the State Department will ever be open as to how much support it had, but there were a lot of people in Chile died. Salvador Allende ended up taking his own life, but there were a lot of left dissidents who ended up going missing and were eventually ended up killed. And I mean, Pinochet's reign in Chile was not great. He was incredibly authoritarian, and one of his favored methods of getting rid of his dissidents was bringing them up into helicopters and pushing them out. So yeah, not a great guy, not a great horse to back. So what Missing is not about a missing Chilean dissident, which I think that's a whole other question as to how do we get Americans to care about something like this? We do have to center it around an American citizen. But reporter Charlie Horman, who was in Chile, went missing. One day, soldiers came to his home, went out, never came back. And his wife, Joyce, at first tried to find him. She couldn't. And she eventually contacted his father, who he was a little bit estranged from, to try to figure that out. And though Joyce Horman and her Charlie's father Edward were kind of politically clashed a bit in terms of their views, they did eventually work together and were both on the same page of the United States government knew something happened to my son, and either they let it happen or they did nothing about it. Or worse, they could have just been like, you know what, it's okay. So that is what Missing is about. And it is based on a book. I read excerpts of it when I was in college, The Execution of Charles Horman. And the movie was, for the most part, made with the cooperation of the family, more so Horman's father. Joyce Horman was a little cagey about how this was going to be portrayed. And that is why in the film, her character's name is Beth, because she was like, I don't know about this, but she's happy enough with the final film and all the interviews I've seen, although her complaint was there's another character there where they felt that they kind of hinted that there might have been romantic feelings between her and Charles, and she's like, that wasn't true and that wasn't needed. But she's like, the stuff that is important about how we were given the runaround by US officials and Chilean officials, and how it took us a really long time to find out what happened to our my husband and his son, was real. So what issues did this movie have? Well, both the filmmakers and Thomas Hauser, the author of the book, were sued by Nathaniel Davis, who was a former ambassador to Chile, and two other officials who, weren't named. What's interesting is in the movie, their names are not used at all. So, it's like, well, way to out yourself there. But the lawsuits were thrown out. This was made in Todd, was it 82 or 81? Thinking it's 82.
Let me double check on that.
Yeah. But it was in the wake of what happened in the Vietnam War. So where America was and where cinema was I think starting to get a little bit more of a nuanced view about America's actions overseas. So there were a couple of movies that really started to look at this. We're going to be looking at another one a little bit later. But Missing is one of 82, yeah. One of the first movies to start to really interrogate what is the United States doing in other countries, and not only how it's affecting us, but how it's affecting others. So moving on, sorry, not a lot of these movies are going to be happy, everybody. It's almost like a lot of the true stories that get turned into films aren't happy. But we're moving a little more modern to Ava DuVernay's Selma. So this was about the 1965 Freedom Marches and about Martin Luther King. One of the things this movie does, which the official reasoning as to why DuVernay did not have the rights to Martin Luther King's speeches, is because they were held up in rights with DreamWorks, and therefore she could not get them. But there has always been some theorizing, and again, there's nothing to support this, but I also kind of wonder if there's truth to it, that because the film acknowledges JFK's infidelity, there is a scene where Coretta is playing a videotape that the FBI sent her, and she's like, well, I know that's not you, but I do know what you're doing, and you need to decide how much you value this marriage. That is not something that is often talked about when it comes to MLK. So there's always been some theorizing that because her movie decided to address that the family was like, nope. But there's a lot of things this movie does get right. Usually when Martin Luther King is talked about, it's the great man theory. He's this one single man who came in, had a dream, solved everything, when that's not really how the civil rights movement worked. He was one of the many activist leaders, but there was a whole network of people. There was a whole coalition. And one of the things Selma gets really right is it pays tribute to all of the other people and how every single person who worked there was essential. And even smaller people like Viola Louise, how I'm saying her name, Liuzzo, a woman who, a housewife who decided to come down to the march and ended up being assassinated on the way back. The big complaint about this film is the depiction of MLK and Lyndon Johnson. So if you watch this movie, I mean, if you know anything about Lyndon Johnson, very passionate about the Civil Rights Act and, did a lot, in many cases, being a big pain to push that through. Whereas the way this movie shows it is he's a little bit more apprehensive, or not apprehensive, but he's telling JFK, like, look, or not JFK, MLK, look, there's what you want and there's what I have to do to convince people. Now, to this criticism, DuVernay says, I am not a historian, I am a storyteller. So this was a dramatic choice she made to kind of show the overall opposition in Washington. She just put it on Lyndon B. Johnson. She knew it wasn't accurate, but she's like, okay, if we do something about all of the politicking Johnson had to do in Washington, we'd have a 3-hour film. So she decided to take a shortcut. But again, as with Titanic, when you start using real people, especially stuff that can be pretty verified by writings. I mean, Richard Caro's been writing about Lyndon B. Johnson for how many years? This is where people start to go, hey, wait a minute. And this question comes in. What is your responsibility as a filmmaker? Are you taking the storytelling approach or are you taking the historian approach? And again, I think a lot of it just comes down to you should not expect these movies to be a history lesson, but it is the what responsibility do you have to be accurate. So on to another historical film, Schindler's List, which I think because World War II and Holocaust dramas have become such a staple of cinema now, we forget that before Schindler's List, films about the Holocaust were not as common and not seen as films that were going to make a lot of money. Sophie's Choice was the exception, not the rule. And if anything, people just looked at it as like, oh, it's so depressing. Why would anybody want to see a movie about that? But Steven Spielberg felt differently. And actually, even he was a little apprehensive to take on this project at first and try to shop it around to other people. There were a few directors who felt, I'm not Jewish. I don't know if I can properly tell the story. Apparently, Spielberg had talked to Polanski about directing it, but Polanski said, like, I got my own story I'd like to tell. And you know what? It's for the best because it wouldn't be great if Polanski was attached to this movie. I feel very bad for what Polanski went through at that point in time in his life, but he did other things that unfortunately just kind of taint these movies now. But Spielberg was very attracted to the story of Oskar Schindler and making this movie, partially his Jewish heritage and getting older and realizing this connection with it. He saw that a lot of survivors were getting older and were starting to die, and this idea of we need to preserve this story. There was also the rise of Holocaust denial and the fact that it was starting to get easier to circulate. So he wanted this film to be an important historical artifact. So he, kind of like James Cameron in Titanic, really tried to make like a painstaking effort to be as accurate as possible. And really, in many cases, there's not too much wrong you can find with this movie. There's certain people that are not featured. Abraham Bankier, who helped with the list, his role is kind of rolled into Stern's. He just becomes an amalgamation of multiple people. Schindler's wife is not as present as she actually was in real life. But I would look at these are small details done simply for the sake of storytelling. People have nitpicked and said, well, the crematoriums that you see, they're showing smoke and they didn't do that in real life. They were specifically built to not to, but that is, I think, something that is very clearly a deliberate choice on a filmmaker's part to show, like, use visual language to let people know what is happening. And I think there's a reason, Todd, correct me if I'm wrong, this is kind of seen as a gold standard as to how not only do a film about probably the worst genocide in modern human history, but adapting a true story.
I mean, especially for this particular, it's like this is the bar that every subsequent film about the Holocaust has been held up to.
Yeah, absolutely. Don't worry, some lighter subjects are coming, everybody. 2013's 12 Years a Slave. Kind of, it's not a one-to-one, but similar to how for a while the Holocaust was just not something covered in cinema, slavery is something that, in terms of how it's depicted in American cinema, has a very long and complicated history. Going back to how freed Black people were depicted in Birth of a Nation, or you have the Hattie McDaniel in Gone with the Wind, who on one hand is a character, a three-dimensional character in that movie, but also plays into this more romanticized vision of the antebellum South. Song of the South kind of had that little iffy history as well. And there's a lot of films that really either downplayed the brutality of slavery or they kind of kept it in the background. So if you watch films like, what was that one with Matthew McConaughey? Free State of Jones or Cold Mountain. These are films that did not have slaves at all. Conveniently, Southerners we can root for who did not have slaves, or it's in the background. It's not something we see. 12 Years a Slave as a film takes a real story. A man named Solomon Northup, who is a free man from the North, was tricked into traveling down and was captured and sold as a slave. And he was enslaved for over a decade before finding an abolitionist to deliver a letter to a friend for him. But this was a film that put the brutality of slavery front and center when it's usually been, again, in the background. And rather than sanitizing it, it's letting you see, like, this is what slavery was like. And the big change in this movie is actually one where Steve McQueen and the screenwriter, they just wanted to get this point across. So if you've seen the film, Benedict Cumberbatch plays William Ford, who is Solomon's first master. So in 12 Years a Slave, which I believe we have a copy here, you can read it, he actually speaks very well of Ford. And he actually called him a model master, very complimentary to him, like he treated us very well. Whereas the film portrays him as ultimately someone who's gutless, who sees the brutality of what he is doing, who sees the brutality of the people in the field masters, and kind of does nothing and just is like, well, that's not my purview. And that was a decision that was made to show, like, there is no real such thing as a good master in the system of slavery. So was this accurate to Northup's account? Technically, no. But if we're talking about slavery as a whole, many would argue this is accurate, because even if you are nice, you are still enslaving other people. This is another one up there, Schindler's List, I've seen it once. It's very good. I don't know if I ever want to watch it again, because it is a rough sit, I think is a good way to put it. And now, again, I feel really bad for putting just all of these films about just horrific periods in history in a row. Another film that interrogates some U.S. action involvement, which is 1984's The Killing Fields. Actually, has anyone seen this film? Feel free to put it in the chat. If you haven't, we have a copy at the library. I would really recommend it. I was first shown this by a history teacher in high school, and she was someone who, she wanted to talk about history that we hadn't heard. So we learned about Nanking. We learned about El Salvador in the 1980s and Archbishop Romero. And she, rather than spending time on Vietnam, which we've talked about before, she wanted to talk about Cambodia. So she taught us about the history of Cambodia. She talked about the Khmer Rouge and the Cambodian genocide, something that at 15 I hadn't heard of. So this film is about that. in the events leading up to it. So the bombing of Cambodia during the Vietnam War, which created conditions for Khmer Rouge, which was an agrarian communist group where their whole, led by Pol Pot, their whole idea was we're going to become an agrarian society, extremely hostile to intellectuals of any kind. If you could read French, which was the former colonialist language, you were considered an intellectual. If you had glasses, they considered you an intellectual. If you had a profession like a doctor, you were killed. And if you're not familiar with the Cambodian genocide, it is thought that about a third of the population of that country was killed between 1975 and 79. So this film is about the lead up to that. And in the lead up, we focus on New York Times reporter Sidney Schanberg and his assistant Dith Pran, who is an interpreter and reporter, but was based in Cambodia. They become friends, and as stuff starts to look really bad, Schanberg is able to at least arrange for Pran's wife and children to get out of the country and get to America. But ultimately, he and his New York Times colleagues are not able to save Pran. And Pran is evacuated with everyone else in Phnom Penh into the rural part of the country. And he is starved, tortured, until he eventually escapes into Thailand in a refugee camp. So why I chose this film was, number one, it's a, this is, I would say, a case of like film can be very helpful, because I had never heard of this before seeing this movie. And my reaction to it was, I should learn more about this. So I think a lot of people can look and go, oh, I'm going to learn more. I should know about this. But the man playing Dith Pran in the film is a man named Heng S. Nor. He was a doctor, and he was also a survivor of the Cambodian genocide. And he was an amateur actor. There was an interview with Nor and Sam Waterston, who plays Schanberg. And Nor actually said, he goes, if anything, I think my experience was worse than Pran's. And when the interviewer elaborated, he said, well, he escaped and got away. I was escaped and recaptured 3 different times. He was able to get his wife and children out there. I lost almost my entire family. I got out, my family's gone. And I don't think there's really any way to measure a tragedy like that. But Nor's experience in killing fields was horrific. He actually lost his wife, who was pregnant. He was an OBGYN, and he couldn't operate on her because he knew if he did, they'd both be killed along with their child. So he pretty much had to hope for the best. And unfortunately, that did not happen. And he was able to eventually escape with his niece. A slight nice postscript is he went back with Pran himself in the late 80s, and he did find that there were a few other family members that he had thought dead that had actually survived. So there is this, when we talk about like what is the filmmaker's responsibility when telling the story, well, Roland Joff, who directed it, he wanted to make sure he found, someone Cambodian to play Dith Pran. He didn't want to just cast anybody, and he certainly wanted to avoid the awkwardness of if anyone's seen the movie Year of Living Dangerously, Linda Hunt plays an Indonesian man. And while it's a great performance, I watched that and I'm like, they couldn't have just held a casting call. So these filmmakers, already felt like we need to find someone who is at least from this background to play the story. They did not know at first that Nor was a survivor. But Nor himself said that he took this role, and I think he only watched the film once. He saw it at the premiere and was like, I'm not doing that again. He's like, acting wasn't hard. It was seeing it that was hard. But he did this because he wanted the world to know what happened to Cambodia. He wanted to tell his country's story. So he saw, as an individual, I have a responsibility to my country and to my family to tell them what happened. And again, this is a case where cinema can be used for good because it can get the story out there. So moving on to Star 80. Has anyone seen another one? Has anyone seen Star 80? Because it's actually a really good movie. The reason I chose this is because of how it tells this story. So it tells the story of Dorothy Stratton, who was a Playboy playmate. And at 20 years old was murdered by her husband, who was, Todd, what's the best way to describe Paul Snider?
Charitably creepy ladder climber.
Yes, I think that's a good way. He is someone who spotted Dorothy when she was a teenager, and figured, oh, she'd be a beautiful model, and pretty much saw her as a star he could hitch his wagon to. And as her career took off and his didn't, he became more and more possessive, and that eventually ended in her death and his. There is a good piece in the Village Voice, it's still available to read, called Death of a Playmate. And what I think this movie really gets right is how it portrays Dorothy Stratton. So if you think about 1980, what were the attitude? I mean, the attitudes of women who chose to pose in Playboy. I mean, we still see this attitude now. There is this almost, when people look at it, they have this like, well, what did she expect in that kind of a profession? But the movie shows that she was not, what she chose to do in Playboy did not bring any of this upon her. It showed that Paul Snider was, again, a creepy ladder climber and put all of the blame on him. She was not someone who was complicit in any of this. And again, this is one where I don't know if it's because Bob Fosse saw a lot of starlets get kind of chewed up and spit out by the industry that he had some sympathy for her, but I am always very astounded when a sympathetic movie is made about someone who is in kind of the sex adjacent industry. I'm like, oh wow, this is just really because I mean, I'll still see this when people talk about her. It's that idea of like, well, maybe if she didn't do that stuff, it's like, I don't think it would have. If she had just gone on to be a regular actress, Paul Snider likely would have still been a jealous person. The bigger issue with this comes from Peter Bogdanovich, who she was having a relationship with as they were filming They All Laughed, which he was directing, and she was trying to kind of get her way into more mainstream films. Also keep in mind, Peter Bogdanovich was he in his 40s at this point?
He might have been, actually. I need to run the
Yeah,
numbers.
she was 20. This poor young woman just constantly, I think if she had any flaws, she was too trusting. But he felt that the way the relationship is portrayed was not how it was. And actually, Bogdanovich wrote a whole book about his relationship with Stratton, but that's another one where it's like, well, you have your own story that you want to sell. Also, a thing to keep in mind with Bogdanovich, I believe he eventually married Stratton's sister. Yeah, I don't think any man in this movie comes out looking great, either in the movie or real life. But it's one where I look at it and I'm like, again, like hey, this is the right way to tell the story rather than going the lurid and sordid route. Tell what it was, which was a trusting young person cut down by someone they thought they could rely on. And Spotlight, which is actually one of my favorite movies to talk about because I actually, when I was in grad school, I interned as a news librarian at the Christian Science Monitor, and I really appreciate how this movie kind of gives a shout out to the news librarians of the Boston Globe a couple of times. But this is about the Spotlight report that came out in 2002, which I gotta say, both Todd and I were from Massachusetts. Oh boy, do we remember when that story broke. I mean, also full disclosure, I was raised Catholic. very quiet in the house when this story came out. Just like Todd, I don't know what your experience was when this story hit.
I suppose the phrase "holy crap" puts it politely. Like it wasn't a
Yeah.
full-blown schism in the house, but it was like there was still kind of that, oh God, this just keeps going.
This gets worse and worse as we read it. But what this movie really gets right, I mean, there's definitely the Hollywood dramatized moments, like Mark Ruffalo's big outburst is definitely made to win him get an Oscar nom. But what the movie gets right is the reporting. That it isn't something where they stumble on one piece of information. It's like, oh, eureka. They have to go down to the archives. There's scenes where they're flipping through directories and they're like, yeah, we've been here for hours. We're still looking. It pays tribute to a lot of the digging that investigative reporting has to do. And it's something that, whenever a lot of newspaper movies you do see, they do kind of tend to be like, oh, we found our one clue. That's it. This blows the whole case open. And this one is more, no, this was a long process. This had a lot of setbacks. The movie shows that the 9/11 attacks put a kibosh on the story for a while. But what it doesn't include, according to a former reporter who did write a piece about this, she's like, I think the movie did a good job. It did a good job portraying these people and the hard work they did. What Alison Bass kind of felt was like, there was reporting before this, and there's like a couple of throwaway lines about it. But she's like, there were a lot of reporters, in particular, she mentioned Eric McLeish, who did a lot of work on this. And she's like, I just felt they were not given their due by the film. And again, this is unfortunately one of the things that happens when you're trying to tell a story for a movie versus real life. She also said, and this is something I think the movie touches on, but according to her, it was a whole lot more pronounced. The Globe was very afraid of being accused of Catholic bashing, and that is why these stories were kind of hidden for so long. So if you're familiar with Boston, very Catholic town, the church is very powerful, and the movie focuses more on like the church has a lot of power in the city. But what it doesn't is that for years, apparently, there was a lot of fear that if they reported on it too much, they would be accused of that. They could lose subscribers. They really made a monetary decision. And that fear was heightened when the new editor came in, played by Liev Schreiber in the film, who was Jewish. And they were like, oh my gosh, we are just going to be accused of this. The movie touches on it a bit, but again, according to someone who worked there, she's like, oh, it was way more than that. But I still think this is a film that shows kind of the mundane process of this, but still manages to make it exciting and, pay tribute to those who actually did that footwork. All right, moving on to something a little more fun to talk about somewhat is, I would argue, the biggest abuse of the true story I have seen, and that is the Amityville Horror franchise. Well, the franchise goes off the rails after movie 3, and honestly, none of these movies were ever good. It's my horror hot take. This franchise is bad. But the Lutz family, George and Kathy Lutz, sold millions of books saying that this house that they bought was haunted. And yeah, no. Todd, has there ever been any real evidence to support their claims of a haunting?
That's gonna be a no. Although I will say on this note, I would sincerely watch a well-made movie about this entire hustle.
Yeah,
I don't think it will ever happen, but I would watch it.
It is 100%. The Lutzes were people who bought a house that they're like, okay, this is a lot more work than we thought. We're a little underwater. We need to unload this. And they're like, let's just sell this angle. There were a lot of lawsuits from that book too, because people were like, hey, wait a minute, I don't think this is true. But where it really gets disgusting, and again, I think absolutely an exploitative move on the filmmakers, is in Amityville 2. So what is true about the original Amityville Horror is that the house that George and Kathy Lutz moved into a mass murder took place there. Ronald DeFeo Jr. killed his whole family. Now, what Amityville 2 posits, and now they aren't named the DeFeos, they knew they couldn't do that, but it pretty much posits that this young man was possessed by the devil, and that is why he killed his family. And I understand, like, I own a lot of horror. I understand that taste is not something that goes for all the time. I own films by Lucio Fulci. I don't expect taste. But to use something like that as a way to sell a horror movie, and to also, in a way, explain away one man's crime, I cannot think of the last time a movie left such a bad taste in my mouth as when I watched Amityville 2. It's like, I mean, granted, I don't think anyone's going to watch Amityville 2 and think like, oh no, Ronald DeFeo was actually possessed by a demon, but it reeks of exploitative to me in a way that a lot of other movies do not. Don't watch either of these movies. They're pretty gross. So while we're talking about, as I've kind of said, responsibility of the filmmaker, we have these 2 Clint Eastwood movies that I think are good to discuss. Clint Eastwood's been on kind of a true story kick lately, but there were 2 films he made that got him in some trouble. So the first was with the 2016 film Sully, which honestly, a film that did not need to be made. It's really boring. Tom Hanks gives a good performance, but that's it. The big problem with this is, so there was an NTSB hearing after the crash. These are actually pretty standard, it's standard operating procedure. They do interrogate the pilot and other people on board to kind of see what happened. And there was always the possibility that he could have lost his license. But the way the film portrays it is almost like they were out to get him. Whereas Sully himself was like, that's not how it happened. Like, we had to go over stuff. They had to question me, but he was the same thing. He goes, this is what happens when there is a crash and there are surviving pilots. They go through every possible scenario of what could have happened, to the point where the real Sully, this is according to Tom Hanks, asked that the script be changed so none of the NTSB people's real names are used, because he's just like, I do not want them, basically people to see this movie and then start potentially harassing them or asking for them to lose their jobs. The other one comes with his film of Richard Jewell, which I actually think is a story that definitely needs to be told. Poor Richard Jewell, talk about a man who just got railroaded, and probably one of the reasons he died early was the stress of being falsely fingered as the potential bomber of the 1996 Olympics. But what that film insinuates is that the Atlanta Journal-Constitution reporter Kathy Scruggs traded sex with John Hamm's character, who plays an FBI agent, for information. And there is nothing to support that at all. And there were a lot of people asking, like, why did you even have to add this detail in? We have a story here. It was about a man who the FBI incorrectly figured might be a suspect, a reporter that ran with it, and a man who kind of had his life ruined. People felt that the addition of this was slanderous towards Scruggs, and she had passed away in 2001. She wasn't even here to defend herself. The editor of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution released a whole editorial who was like, this is not great. And also kind of adding to this controversy, people pointed out, they're like, okay, you're holding Scruggs to the fire, but you're naming her by name in this film. However, you are not naming the FBI agents who falsely suspected Richard Jewell. And also another thing, Todd, as you've pointed out, or Todd, do you want to make that point as to what the film kind of brushes over?
I mean, either or. Long story short, the film does kind of downplay the fact that they did the film even name the actual Haim Rudolph, or?
Oh no, I think when they eventually caught Rudolph for something else, they realized, oh, he confessed and was like, oh, that was me. But Eric Rudolph was a terrorist. He bombed women's health clinics. He bombed gay bars. I think that was what he was finally caught for, but he was the one who tried to bomb the 96 Olympics. So people have pointed out, how come you are demonizing this reporter or adding this extra layer when, you know, there's enough there to kind of make her not look great already, but you're not doing the same for the FBI, who truly was the person who started this whole thing with Richard Jewell. And again, this is where it's like, how far is too far with dramatic license, especially when real people are going to be affected by this. So 2 films left. I promise you this one's funny. One of my favorite films of the 2010s is Death of Stalin. And this is, as you can guess, about the death of Joseph Stalin and the just free-for-all power grab to find his successor. It was eventually Malenkov, but not for long. And for a comedy, this movie actually does get a lot kind of right. A lot of the main events in this film, and this is kind of what we start to notice, it's like, okay, they get all the main things right. There's some small things they change around. So the concert at the beginning that they have to re-record, that something along those lines did happen. Not exactly as portrayed in the film, but it did. The trial of Beria and just how awful he was, that's all true. That's, and just the general like snippiness of everyone in Stalin's inner circle. Like, you have these people who you think of as being terrifying, and they are, but then when it comes time to name a successor, it's like they're little snipping mean girls. That's something the film gets really right. And the other thing it gets right is that the joke is never on the people of the USSR. They are always squarely the victims of this, and the people at the top are the ones who are awful. So what does this film not get right? Some stuff exaggerated for comedic effect. There's a few things like Khrushchev is a lot more marginalized in the movie than he was in real life. He was, you know, he wasn't the odd man out as he is portrayed here. And again, this is for the sake of storytelling. The biggest one, I would actually say, there's 2 things. So the trial of Beria, so the arrest of Beria and the trial of Beria and his execution, that happened within a year, whereas the film portrays it as happening within a number of days. And again, this is for the sake of dramatic expedience. The other one is Svetlana. So Stalin's daughter, Svetlana, you see her being pretty much immediately exiled in the film. Reality, she defected in 1967, and it was actually a big blow to the USSR. But I would say, if you want a historical comedy, Death of Stalin is fantastic. And I put that line in there that I loved. It's Molotov is played by Michael Palin, just as they're getting ready to get rid of Beria. He just goes like, oh, Stalin would be loving this. And terrifyingly, he's right. So our final film, I wanted to end on something light, is Milk. And a good example of where biopics kind of started to go in the late aughts into the 2010s is, again, moving away from we're telling this whole character's life story and into let's focus on a moment of his life. So Milk, directed by Gus Van Sant, decided to focus on his political career in San Francisco. We don't see Harvey Milk as a young kid. We don't see him as a young 20-something. We see him when he's in his 40s and kind of making a change in life. It helps it's based on the life and times of Harvey Milk. Great documentary if you haven't seen it. So the movie really gets right is it shows that Harvey he got politics, and he got how you ingratiate yourself to people, but it also got that he could be a bit of a pain with people. And again, if he wanted something done his way, he would make sure it was done that way. And it also kind of focuses on how he's so involved with politics that he neglects a lot of his personal relationships. And similar to Selma, the film absolutely does avoid the great man theory. And it's like, no, Harvey Milk was groundbreaking, but there were a lot of people that he mentored and there were a lot of people that helped him out that did a lot of the groundwork for him. So it is this idea of coalition building that a lot of older films about these heroic, groundbreaking figures kind of neglect to mention. It's like it wasn't just one person who had an idea and said, I'm going to change the world. It was a lot of people. It was the effort of many. So what does this film really get wrong? There is not a throwaway line. It's emphasized. But it kind of leans into the idea that Dan White, the man who murdered Harvey Milk, may have been closeted. And that is something that there's been no evidence for at all. It seems like it really was just a grudge killing because Dan White looked like he was losing his seat and kind of was mad at the mayor and Milk for what he saw as the loss of his political career. It also, at the end, still perpetuates this myth of the Twinkie defense for Dan White. So if you're not familiar with what that is, when Dan White was on trial, his defense tried to argue that he was depressed and he wasn't himself. And one of the things they were saying was he was eating sugary foods like Twinkies. That got kind of morphed into, in popular culture, his defense argued that he had eaten so much sugar he wasn't in his right frame of mind, and that's where the Twinkie defense comes in. But that's not what the defense actually was. It was just saying his dietary habits were not what they usually were. This was a sign of depression. This was a sign that he was not in his right mind. And again, I think this movie's really good. It's a wonderfully optimistic film. It is about having hope. It's about staying in the fight. I don't like Sean Penn at all, but even I gotta admit he gives a great performance. But I was actually like, even in 2008, I'm like, wait a minute, that Twinkie defense thing isn't true. Come on, guys. Like, you did all of this other work and then you do this. So again, even movies that do most of their homework can sometimes have a couple of inaccuracies. And with that, we've still got some time. And I'll see if anyone has any questions. Oh, someone saw Star 80. Okay. Because I always wonder, it's like, does anyone know this movie exists?
Well, it was on cable a few times. So, and Eric Robert is so creepy in that movie. It's like, oh my God.
What do you think of Crawdads? I haven't seen Where the Crawdads Sing. I actually have not read that book. Sorry, I usually when everyone's reading the book, I just go, I'll read it later. And then, 10 years, I get to it. But yeah, if I had to pick, Todd, of all the films we discussed tonight, which one would be the one you'd recommend the most? Or I guess say one in terms of entertainment, one in terms of accuracy.
Entertainment is Death of Stalin. That's
hell yeah. It's a great movie.
Accuracy, ooh. I mean, I feel like the obvious answer here is Missing, just because that one, they really lean into trying to make sure they had as much they had their ducks in a row on that one as they could.
Oh, absolutely. And it's a when that movie came out, the US was not as forward, and they're still, I would not say they're forward now. I don't think we're ever really going to find out how much involvement we had in that coup. But it really is one where, like, I think only Costa Gravas could have made this. I almost don't think an American filmmaker could have at the time, but yeah, it's one where I think they, because there was stuff written on it, and because Charlie Horman's father was fairly high up in America, like, I think that helped get it made. And that also, I think, helped protect the film a little bit, and allowed them to be as kind of have that indictment of this policy and the idea of, like, I mean, I still remember the final shot of Missing, where you're just seeing that casket come off the plane, and just that, like, they finally got his body back. And at the end of the film, there is still this idea of, like, they're still not entirely open with what happened to him. And I don't know if they're I think Hauser's book is probably the closest we'll have, but I mean, you know, I was an international affairs major. The United States, like a lot of major governments, can be involved in a lot of not great stuff. So I would probably trust the Hormans in that book over what the State Department says. And I would say the same thing again for other major countries. Like I would take what the Chinese government says with a grain of salt as well. But yeah, I would say it's missing 12 Years a Slave or Schindler's List are probably the three. Killing Fields as well. I feel whenever filmmakers are dealing with these very heavy subjects, I think there is for a lot of them this duty they feel like we have to get this right. Versus when you have stuff like, again, Amityville Horror, it's like, yeah, we'll use this very real tragedy as a basis for our horror movie. Oh, also, Todd, didn't Amityville, they said that this was built on an ancient burial ground or something?
Maybe that can't be one of the sequels.
Oh,
I'm gonna be honest. I read the book. I saw the first movie. I couldn't tell you anything past that.
I mean,
Yeah, I did the same thing and I can't remember. Read the book and watched the movie.
Like, in a vacuum, the book is entertaining pulp, but yeah, no, the fact they tried to sell it as real is nonsense.
Yeah, well, like the first one, you could almost say it's harmless because you're like, okay, this is a family trying to unload bad property. The second one where I'm like, that's unconscionable. Even if they didn't use the real names, everyone knew who they were referencing. They all knew they were referencing the DeFeo family. And it's, if you ever do watch that movie, or I would just say read the Wikipedia summary, the things that they insinuate about that family as well are really disgusting. And I'm not shocked the DeFeo family didn't sue because the makers could just say we didn't use your names. But oh my gosh, I would be livid if I were the relatives of that family with that film. Like, I don't even know anyone in that family, and I was angry for them watching it. I was like, this is disgusting.
That's interesting because based on a true story does kind of get bandied around in horror films, but never quite as egregiously and openly as that one.
Well, I mean, there's the whole thing with The Conjuring, the Warrens who, look, it's okay to like those movies, but the Warrens, Ed and Lorraine Warren, were con artists. They had a racket and they would just say things were haunted, and there's no real proof of that. As of now, who knows? Maybe one day we'll be proven wrong. But again, that's one where it's still relatively like, again, a little harmless. It's when you take a very real killing of a family and try to insert the demonic possession into it. That's where I'm like, you know what? That's a line. All right. Well, it is almost 8 o'clock. So hopefully we'll see you all next month for Werner Herzog, everyone's favorite German director.
Great
Thank
job,
you, Liz
guys.
and Todd. This was great
Great.
tonight.
Oh,
Great
awesome.
job. Great job.
And I'm personally hope you're all going to be here for September because I have been aching to do a Don Bluth program for years at this point. I mean, I can't promise I won't sing the song from An American Tail, but we'll see. All right. Have a good night, everyone.
Thanks. Take care.
Bye, everybody.
very
Thank
much.
you.
Bye. Take care, everybody.
Bye.
Good night.
Bye-bye.